second submitter here, and you will have Phil Ellis listed as our speaker today. His son Cameron is here speaking on his behalf. So Cameron, I welcome you to the front, and just for your information, you have 10 minutes for each submission, because I understand you're submitting on two separate policies. Yes. So we will actually, rather than a ballot 5, we'll do a ballot 10 minutes, just to let you know. Okay. Halfway through, and then a double bell at 20 minutes.
Sounds good.
And that will include question time from councillors. So welcome.
Sounds good. Hello everybody. Yep, my name is Cameron Ellis. I'm here on behalf of Phil, who couldn't make it down today as he's still stuck up in Auckland. I'll trust that everyone's had a chance to read over the submissions that he's sent through. So I'll keep this rather quick and to the point and leave it to any questioning. So firstly, in regards to the submission on the rates remission policy, on policy number 6, it talks about splitting increases in rates up to 25% over 3 years. So in effect, that would limit it to about 8% increase per year. Well, this is good for people that have significant increases. It doesn't cover the scenarios where we have massive increases. For example, our property, and I'm sure there are other similar properties, have gone up 200%. So we're going from paying $2,500 a year, proposed to $7,500 a year. So this policy doesn't really cover us. If we are to say, okay, let's split that 200% increase over 3 years, we're still looking at a 60% increase per year. I think that everyone could probably agree that a 60% increase in rates solely because we own the property isn't really fair and reasonable. So on that, we would submit that there be a cap of, say, 10%, that the rates cannot be increased by more than that per year, and that would compound yearly. If that is not adopted, because our property has gone up in value so much, it's because QV has to value the property based on the potential of subdivision. And so the reason that we've gone from a land value of $760,000 to 3.2 million is because they've come in and said, okay, you've got about 80 acres, and you can probably split this up based on the zoning into 6 to 8 lots. So they've pushed us all the way up to 3.2 million. So we would like to say, if properties are valued on this basis, then there should be a separate rates remission scheme to cover these sort of properties, to encourage developers to develop the land versus come in and say, okay, we're going to jack the rates up. Not so much that the rates are getting jacked up, but because the property values have gone up so much, now our rates have gone up so much. So some sort of remission scheme where if the landowner submits a resource consent application to develop the land, then a rates remission scheme would then kick in to say, okay, you don't have to pay the increase in the rates for a certain, for the year that it gets submitted. And then from the time that the application is approved, give the landowner a time period of, say, 3 years or until titles are issued for those increases to then kick in. And now once the increases do kick in, when you're subdividing the land, you're just taking one block and making it into multiple blocks. Well, there's no real increase or burden on the city until someone's actually living on that land. So we think there should be some way where the increases will happen once the land is subdivided to 50% of the increase. And then when building consent is issued and there's someone living there and burdening the city, then the full 100% rate increase on that specific title should then be in effect. This will kind of encourage people with land that can be developed to develop the land, versus being in a position of, okay, now my rates have gone up through the roof. An example, we're developers, so we will get on and develop our land, but we have a neighbour whose land has gone up significantly, similar to ours, but he will never be able to develop the land. And even if he could, or even if there was access into his property, he would have to be able to know what he's doing. So by jacking up the rates, he's either forced to sell his property, or hopefully he has enough money that he can continue to pay these rates. So we just don't think it's really a fair way for people who may have sat on land for 50 plus years, who now have property that has gone up 3 times as much, to now be stuck in a position of, I have to either figure out how I'm going to pay these rates, or I need to sell my property. So that's kind of everything on the rates remission side of things. If anyone has any questions on that.
I'll open up to councillors for questions on the rates remission policy. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Cameron. Just a question from me. I understand in terms of QV's reasoning around why they've gone to a model where they value based on potential subdivision is actually around incentivising people to develop. And just interested in your view, if council was to introduce a remission around what you're, around the, similar themes of what you're talking about, whether that would actually counter the incentive to develop, which QV was trying to incentivise?
I think I don't know if it so much incentivizes people to develop by saying, okay, our property has gone from 760 to 3.2 million. Like, we would know if we can subdivide the land, if it's worth how much lots are selling at the moment, which most landowners do know. They're going to know, okay, if I can subdivide my land into this many blocks, and each block is going to be worth this much money. But I think by coming in and them valuing it at 3.2, I don't know if it really fairly takes into account everything that goes on within the development, because they've factored in the costs of doing the development and certain things, which I don't think they're fully privied on with doing the development. So I think that it would probably get people to start thinking of doing it, but I don't think everyone probably has the ability to actually go and do the development or the know-how. So I think it's probably done good and bad in different ways, but I don't know if it so much encourages people to get on and do it versus kind of either forces them to do it or forces them to kind of get out. Like for us, we know what our property is worth, and we know when we subdivide it what it's going to be worth and what it's going to sell for. But for someone who doesn't know about doing development and has no idea, I don't know if saying, okay, well, we're going to take your rates and we're going to spike them really incentivizes them to actually do the development. It might, I guess there's 2 approaches. There's, okay, you're going to need to sell your property to a developer who's going to be able to handle the rates, or get on and do it. So I don't know if it so much is really fair and reasonable for the guy that may not want to develop the property, although I don't know if that fits in with your initiatives and everything to get development going. But I think if there's a way for the city to encourage it by helping with the rates and give the helpful approach versus the, okay, rates have gone through the roof, make something happen approach. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Councillor Simpson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Cameron, I'm just trying to get a gauge, and I fully understand what you're referring to, because many blocks of land, currently lifestyle blocks, were valueless up until about 5 years ago. Suddenly, they're being valued at astronomical amounts. So is your concern about the developability of the land, in other words, QV does a blanket valuation across those parcels of land without actually stepping foot on site and doing an evaluation of how much of that land is actually developable, which may ultimately be reflected in our district plan or not. So is your concern about whether those parcels of land are developable, or is it about how the land is valued?
I think QV does take into account some aspects of it in terms of the cost to develop the land. Now, whether they have a full understanding on the zoning and the district plan and the gradient of roads and how it can actually be accomplished, I would probably assume that they don't know the code of practice in depth to know exactly what can happen. For example, on our property, I think they valued it based on 10 lots being able to happen. Well, on our current zoning, we can only do 6. So we're being valued on something that's really not achievable. Maybe in the future, with rezoning, it might be possible, and that's what we hope for. But I think it's not so much the valuation side of things, but more the approach on these lifestyle blocks, like you say, going up through the roof, and now the property owner who knows nothing about development is now in a position of, well, now I have to sell my property or figure out how I'm going to turn into being a developer or come up with enough money to get a developer to come in and do this for me, which a lot of people don't have that capability. We're a bit different, that we do have the capability and we will get on and do it. But for the guy that just owns a lifestyle block that can be split up into a few blocks, knows nothing about doing development, I think we're just more trying to get the point that there should be a more of a helping hand from the rate side of things to say, okay, if rates are going to go up, well, we will encourage you by saying if you get on and do the development or figure out a way, then we will reduce the rates until that development has actually happened versus spike the rates to get the development happening. Yeah.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you. So just a point of clarification, in your proposal you're saying pay full rates as they're rated for now, or proposed, until you put in a resource consent to do the development, and at that point the remissions would kick in?
Yeah, I think we'd like to push on the point of there being a cap to the increase. So rather than our property going up 200%, there is obviously a cap to say, okay, 10%. But if that isn't something that does get adopted, then yeah, I think we go with, okay, rates do increase. But if in that year of the tax or the rate year, if you do submit your plan, then you get the rates remission on it. And then a period from the time of that application being approved, so to stop people from saying, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to send this application in and then it's going to get approved and I'm not going to do anything for the 10 years that it's allowed to happen. So there should be a limit to say, okay, you've got 3 years to actually make it happen, or 5 years, or whatever it may be, or until titles are issued, whichever comes first. Yeah.
Just another question. Do you realise you can ask GV for a revision of your valuation? So if you do think it's based off 10, it's only 6, you might be able to get your property devalued, if that was what you wanted?
Yes, no, we did have them come out and revalue, but it was basically around the same. We've put a pretty long driveway through our property, and they've kind of put that as land value and saying that that unlocks the value of the land by having this big driveway in there versus kind of capital value. So I guess it kind of gets into the thing about should properties be taxed based on the land value or the capital value, which I guess is a whole bigger conversation, which I think Phil has kind of come in and spoke to everyone about. So yeah, no, we have gone down that route, but yeah, it didn't really make any difference.
Thank you.
Just a question from myself. So with regards to those property owners who actually have no intention to develop, even though the ability is there, so what is it that you're suggesting for those circumstances?
I think for those circumstances, it's just going to be the cap of, okay, it can only increase a certain amount every single year and just slowly going up versus at the moment, if you split hours, it would go up 60%. So just a more reasonable increase. Yeah.
I see. Councillor Bogue.
Yes, thank you very much for your submission. Lots of really interesting and progressive ideas.
Yeah.
I just wanted to let you know that our officers have responded to your suggestions in quite a comprehensive way. And you can see that in the agenda if you pick up a copy on the way out, because
Okay.
you cover a lot of ground, and I think it would be helpful when we come to our deliberations. We'll be looking at your submission. We'll also be looking at the information given us by the officers, so it might be helpful for you to understand where we may be coming from.
Gotcha. Yep.
Thank you.
Now, I'm just conscious that we haven't actually got to the second submission as yet.
Yes.
So we'll move on to that one now.
Okay.
Great.
Sounds
thank you.
good. Okay. So in terms of the development and financial contributions, I think so far, just based on our time doing development in Napier, I think we've contributed about $300,000 or something like that for all the new titles that we have created, which I think has worked out about $16,000 per title. Now, in that, we really have no idea where that money has actually gone or what infrastructure Napier has had to upgrade for that, and that's partly probably on us that we didn't question it at the time. We just kind of accepted that this is the fee, this is the financial contribution. But we feel that with these contributions, the developer should know how that number is come to. Now I know we probably don't have as big of a financial contribution as some other places, and I know these contributions are quite a sticking point for developers. I know it's 40 grand or so per lot in Te Awa and other places for different reasons, upgrading of stormwater and whatnot. But I think for our scenario, and it might be for other developer scenarios, if there's a fair and transparent way to say, okay, this is how we're actually getting to these numbers, and this is the infrastructure upgrades that are having to happen because of your development. Now, in that, because there is a crisis in New Zealand and there's a shortage of homes and sections available for everyone, we feel that there should be some sort of taking on from the city to say, okay, we are willing to come to the table and invest to make these projects happen. And it shouldn't just be a conservative approach to say, okay, this is what we think it's going to cost, so let's make sure we cover our bases to make sure we get enough from the developer to cover what our costs might be, worst case scenario. And the city should look at it and say, okay, we're going to get these rates, we are adding social and economic benefit to the city by making these developments happen. So the city should be willing to say, okay, we will invest up to this much to actually make this happen, which I don't know what percentage that is, but I think that there should be some collaboration between the developer and the city to say, okay, this is what we're looking at. These are the benefits for the city. The city is willing to come up and pay for X amount to actually make that happen by the way of central government grants, or from borrowing money at a lower interest rate than what developers can get the money for. So I think if there's some way that the developers and the city can get together and collaborate to make development happen and get over the hurdle of these large upfront contributions. For example, when we subdivide, say, a stage of 10 lots, as soon as we get titles, we have to pay $150,000 then and there. I'm sure that $150,000 isn't being spent by the city in that exact moment, unless the city has put in a bunch of infrastructure, but in our case, the city didn't put in any infrastructure. So I think there needs to be some thought about when these contributions are paid and how these numbers are calculated. So one of our proposals would be to shift the upfront payment so that developer isn't burdened with the full cost. So if the council says, okay, we're willing to pay for 50% of this contribution to make this development happen, then the other 50% is on the developer. So much of that 50% should be due once titles are issued, and then the remainder could be due when there are actual residents living in there, and the cost could then be moved from the developer paying upfront to, say, a building consent stage, and that could go onto each resident, and they buy in knowing that they've got this cost coming with it, and the developer can alternatively sell the section for a little bit less because they're not hit with this big upfront cost. So yes, I think that's kind of the gist of it. How that gets done, leave it up to everyone.
Thank you, Cameron. So open up for any questions from councillors. No? Okay. Thank you very much for your time today.
Yep, thank you as well.
I understand Judith Guy is here, so we will call you up a little bit early since our other speaker's not here. And just for your information, you have 10 minutes with a ballot 5 minutes, so you know how time's going.
Excuse me, Madam Mayor, is this the submission we had emailed to us
Yes,
today?
and
So it's not in our...
No, and there should be
cool.
a separate.
Thank you, yep, lovely.
Okay.
Welcome, Judith.
Right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to come and speak to you. We've submitted a submission on behalf of the local Labour Party, a working group with the Labour Party, and I think we fit very well our previous submitters' conversation to everyone. Basically, what we wanted to do in our submission was to establish a few principles, and want to say that really what we are all here about is providing for a community as a whole, providing more affordable housing, providing a sustainable community that we can all be part of. We support the changes to the funding model that are proposed, and we encourage the council to maximise its use of available government funds and loans for future infrastructure. We realise that the funding model is talking predominantly about the provision of housing for older people in our community, but we believe that actually the mandate of the council should be expanded so that we are meeting societal needs as a whole. And the discussions about maximising the return on land available really shouldn't be the priority of this group when we have large sectors of our community who are not able to access affordable land or to build low-cost housing on the sections that are made available. We believe that there is a critical need for low-cost housing in the Napier area, and so there needs to be land that is made available for affordable housing stock. When we look at the subdivisions that have been created in recent years, they've predominantly been aiming at middle to upper middle class people. And there hasn't been the opportunity to build lower cost housing anywhere. And subsequently in areas like Maraenui and Mariwa, there's been a phenomenal amount of infill, and the numbers of people living per house or per section is phenomenally above that in other areas of our city. So we believe that you should come to a policy where there are affordable sections designated, lands made available for low-cost housing, affordable sections are designated, and you come up with a mechanism where those sections become, those properties are retained as affordable sections and can't be sold on to developers for redeveloping or sold on at certain profit margins. There are mechanisms publicly available that other places have utilised to try to retain low-cost housing affordability. At the moment, when we have a subdivision, there are an enormous number of covenants on those subdivisions, like in relation to fencing, in relation to garaging, and so on. And when we look back, and I think of my own in-laws building out in Onikawa 40, 50 years ago, and the property, they built the fences when they could afford them. They built the garage 5 years after they had built the houses, but they ended up with a substantive and nice home, but they didn't move into it in that particular state. We also need to think about, I look over Parklands and I see all these individual bungalows and the incredible use of space that we waste opportunities for in this country. You know, I've lived in places abroad where we've had multi-level housing, two-storey housing, row housing, terraced housings. Even in Christchurch, Auckland, that kind of housing is going in place now. There is a demand for it, but yet in Napier, the type of subdivisions that are being developed don't include anything of any kind of density at all, which would solve some of the problems of availability. When I used the rate calculator, that was on the website, no longer there, that was on the website to have a look at how some of the rates changes were going to affect our various communities. I noted that up where I live, up the hill there, actually there's hardly any rates change predicted at all. And yet for my colleagues who live down in Mariwa, Maraenui, proportionally the rates change is higher. And it's just simple economics 101. These demand for low-cost houses has gone up amongst investors and first home buyers. Proportionally, their properties have risen more than mine, and therefore they're going to be whacked with a more substantive rate change. And I think that we have a moral responsibility as a community and as a council to actually address that. Again, there's less housing for people in that lower socioeconomic bracket, and they are the ones who are consistently being hit harder. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Judith. Do we have any questions? Councillor Taylor.
Welcome, Judith. Are you aware that we are currently looking at reviewing the district plan?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So some of the things that you've raised about infilling, multi-storey, all of those things are included in there. So
That's right.
you'll be submitting to that, no doubt.
We will. Okay.
And I guess to expand on that, a lot of those things are also covered in the new national policy statements, which are actually now providing very clear direction to local councils about subdivisions, which include, multi-unit dwellings and multiple stories and things like that. So that's certainly the direction that's being provided at a national level.
Yeah, and what we're doing really is endorsing that direction and really trying to just make the people who are making decisions here aware that we really need to make those decisions in a very balanced way. They're about doing the right thing for the Napier ratepayer, but they're more about doing the right thing for the community as a whole, because we all benefit when everybody in the community is benefiting. Yeah.
And I think that's a really, really important point in terms of when we're looking at these affordable and social housing subdivisions. It is about getting the balance right so that we're creating communities that we can all be proud of. So that I think we do have covenants in areas for reasons sometimes, and it is to control the design and the build that's going in to create really positive outcomes. So it's always very much a balancing act.
Yeah, no.
So
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to come along.
Thank you very much,
Okay,
Judith.
Cheers.
He's ready to zoom in.
Okay.
Zoom in.
Right, we now have Oliver Boyd on behalf of Somerset Group Holdings, who will be zooming in. Here he is. Welcome, Oliver.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
It's a little bit quiet. I don't know if that's our end or your end. Okay, we'll adjust at our end, Oliver. So if you talk, we'll increase the volume from our side.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep, great.
Am I okay to launch into my submission, or our submission?
Go for it.
Okay, great. Look, I know you guys are all busy and you've probably got a whole bunch of other submitters in a day of it, so I'll try to keep it as short as possible. So thank you for the opportunity to submit on the draft financial contributions policy. Aaron Smale, who's our GM development, isn't available today with other commitments, so I'm here on his behalf and the company's behalf. So Somerset's a second largest developer and operator of retirement villages in New Zealand. We cater for only comprehensive care retirement villages, which attract an older demographic. On average, the residents in our villages move in when they're 81 years old, and by the time the village is fully built and occupied, the average age is more like mid-80s. So I think just think about us and against a lifestyle village, which you would typically see residents with more like 60 to maybe 70, probably still have done a lot of travel and whatnot. Our residents, by the fact that we have full continuum of care on site, attract the much older demographic, and the reasons for moving into our village are usually needs-based. So that's the background on Somerset and what we do. We have a huge increase in our demographic numbers coming. It's only just started, and we won't see the fullness of that increase in both the proportion of elderly in New Zealand population and the sheer increase in the number of 75 plus people for another sort of 10 to 25 years. So there's a big wave coming, and we want to ensure that our future residents have options and choice, including comprehensive care retirement villages. So I'll skip through the rest of the introduction. In terms of low occupancy and demand profile, I've talked about our residents being of an older demographic, and that necessitates a lower demand on civil infrastructure, including community facilities and reserves. Our residents spend more time within the village and utilising the facilities that are provided and amenities which are provided within the village than they would when they were of a younger age and more active in the use of those facilities. And then in terms of water and wastewater, they typically would use less water and wastewater than a typical household. So I'll skip through the section titled Low Occupancy and Demand Profile. I've just given you a general overview of that. And then in terms of Council's draft policy and the move towards financial contributions in lieu of development contributions under the Local Government Act, we're opposed to that. We see development contributions as a much fairer regime and more transparent, and that's supported by the Planning Institute's recommendations. So that particular part of the policy we're opposed to. We think it doesn't go far enough in terms of recognising that unique lower demand profile on community infrastructure under the current policy. That lower use, that lower demand is sort of broken into two parts. One is there's less people per unit. So a typical household might have 2.5 to 2.7 people per unit across the country. It varies. Our residents, on average, we have 1.3 residents per unit, irrespective of how many bedrooms that unit might have. So that's a metric that we have gauged across our 6,200 residents that we currently look after. And so we're pretty confident with those numbers. And then in terms of, so you've got a population discount, there's less people living in a unit, and then there's a lower usage per person than against a typical, person of a younger demographic or younger profile that would be, assessed in that HUI calculation. So they're not teenagers having 3 showers a day. I don't know if many of you in the room have grandparents, but you can probably understand that when you're in your 80s, your usage mobility is typically reduced, and therefore you are placing a lower demand on those facilities. So we've outlined in our submission what we think the units of demand in terms of a HUI equivalent should be, and that's generally based on the Auckland Council's development contributions policy, which is by far probably the most tested and sophisticated development contributions policy and across New Zealand. So we're saying that, for completeness and consistency, it should reflect what's already essentially accepted in Auckland. And then finally, our submission talks about timing. Our developments are necessarily larger than your typical household development. That's because we provide care on site. Our care buildings cost in the order of $50 million, and to support that, that being a sustainable operation, we need a number of independent living units, usually surrounding a care building in the middle. So our submission is that timing should be assessment on lodgement of resource consent. So what is the policy at the time that we lodged a resource consent for the village? And then payment should be on code of compliance when the demand actually comes into effect, before our residents occupy the units and turn on the taps, etc. So that's essentially the formal submission that we've provided. The only other thing I would say is some of you may be familiar with our Te Awa retirement village, which I was intimately involved in the acquisition, design and consenting for that village. And we are still trying to negotiate contributions for that village. It's a combination or a mixture of financial and development contributions. We've had a long, negotiation with council, and we're, as I say, we're still negotiating. In fact, it feels like we're going backwards. So I think simplicity for everyone and transparency is key for development contribution regimes. We want to pay our fair share, absolutely, about that, but it needs to be fair and reasonable and clear for all. So that's essentially our submission. I'm happy to take any questions that the room might have.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Just a question from myself. You mentioned that Auckland City Council obviously has quite a comprehensive development contribution policy. Just slightly diverging from that part of it, you've requested that there is a differentiation between comprehensive care versus lifestyle village, and that should be reflected in the way that rates are charged. Is there councils around the country that currently have that differentiation within their policies?
There tends to be differentiation in the unit typology, so a care unit versus an independent unit. I don't think, from memory, we've seen a council that has specifically recognised independent units within a comprehensive care village attract an older demographic. But as I say, that is inherently accepted in the Auckland Council's DC's policy, and that was tested through through commissioners through that objection process by, I guess, other leaders in the industry.
And so with regard specifically to development contribution policies, is Auckland the only council that currently has that highlighted, or is there a number of other councils around the country that have also included that?
No, Christchurch, Wellington have moved over time toward that Auckland kind of regime where that lower demand is recognised. We clearly don't think it's enough, but there's certainly in the bigger metropolitan areas where there are more retirement villages, this is tested more often. I mean, your typical residential developer is not going to query development contributions because their demand matches what the policy says, i.e. they're a typical household there building a 600, 500, 400 square metre section with a 3-4 bedroom house. We're different, and I guess it's about convincing you guys that that is the case.
Thank you. Any other questions from councillors? Deputy Mayor Brosnan.
Thank you, Oliver, for your submission. One of the issues I was particularly keen on your view in was the lower occupancy arguments that you make throughout the submission. And I wonder if you could just comment for me. I'm obviously aware that you would also have a range of employees, care associates, etc., involved in different parts of the village, and whether or not you've done those calculations on occupancy as a whole rather than just on the lifestyle residential component.
Well, occupancy relates to permanent occupancy. We do, in terms of our water and wastewater usage, the staff using our staff facilities is included in that lower demand. But you're right, there is demand created in the care facility by those external parties. But in terms of permanent occupancy, which is what the Huey regime, I guess, is based on, there isn't staff living within our independent units. Or living on our site in general. It's, essentially water and wastewater usage within their site. And then for council, community and reserves and facilities, they would be assessed on their house where they live, under the wider policy.
Thank you.
Councillor Bogue.
Thank you, Oliver, for that. Just a question to clarify something. I understand that people who move into Somerset villages, they all have owned their own homes. Is that all your clients, all your tenants?
Most of them probably would have. They usually sell their home, which frees up that home for a family, I guess, more efficient use of that property. So not only when we're building new dwellings, are we creating homes that are more efficient, I guess, for that resident. Their family homes freed up for, and it's usually 20 to 30 hectares of residential property is freed up into the property market for families. A lot of our residents come from 4 or 5 bedroom homes, and this is their first step from downsizing. They've chosen to stay in their house as long as they possibly can, and as I say, there's been a needs-based decision that's driven them to make that choice to move in with us. So yes, most of them would sell their own homes. A few may have come from a rental situation, but we do sell our independent units under a licence to occupy, so I guess that necessitates a base capital amount that they have to contribute.
Thank you.
There's no further questions, so thank you very much for your time, Oliver.
Thanks very much. Good luck with the rest of it.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Okay, so we are trying to get hold of our final submitter, Chris Lambourne, but at the moment we will adjourn for a morning tea break, which isn't probably quite ready, but...
No, we don't. Just with respect to this, my understanding is that we need to break it in 45
Okay.
to get upstairs for